working now mostly outside the academy, so I'm a little bit like a musician without a record label, who after the says after the gig you can buy my CD in the lobby. So this is my CD or nearest equivalent. It's my book Ecological Ethics, and I'm only mentioning it because you might find it interesting. It offers an ecocentric perspective on a lot of the things that we've been talking about, which is still quite unusual. I want to thank, obviously, Deborah and Eduardo for inviting me to this very special event. It's really an honor to be here. And I also want to thank all you Lusophones and Francophones for putting up with me speaking in English. The talk I'm going to give is actually not my paper, which is fairly long. So I considered just reading it really fast and overrunning by a long time, but I decided instead I will simply talk about my paper, concentrating on a few points. The good news, and I know you'll be relieved to hear this, is that these points are pretty simple. The bad news is, however, that each of these points is really big. So if you want more argument and detail, you'll have to find it in my paper, which I hope you might read, and I think it's on the conference website, or it will be. And it's also got all the references for the names that I might mention that you might not be familiar with. So don't worry about, don't make a big effort to remember what they are or wonder what the titles of the books are, because that's all in the paper too. By the way, I need to revise that paper already on the basis of everything I've learned in the week so far. So, but anyway, the thing that's there at the moment will do for now. Part of the context for what I want to say today is contemporary ecocide. Basically the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth, this time caused solely by human beings. Quite a distinction. It's not only a matter of climate change. There's biodiversity crash, destruction of wild habitat, damage to ecosystemic integrity, and pollution, all of which are extremely serious. The other part of my context is a sense of humility. It seems to me extremely unlikely that either the global power elites or the masses of poor people will ever hear us or be directly influenced by what we say here. Nevertheless, that leaves a lot we can do in the middle, so to speak, or in the margins of power, which is probably where change comes from anyway. I think citizens' initiatives, global and local, but in any case independent of the state, are pretty key to any hope that remains. Sometimes also what you don't do is as important as what you do. And although it's not my subject here, and it's not going to probably make me very popular, certainly won't increase the number of invitations I get to dinner parties, I want to say there is one thing we can all not do. Stop eating industrially produced meat. Refuse to participate in and support this system of gross inhumanity, barbaric cruelty, and ecological devastation with lethal consequences for the remaining wild animals. We learned yesterday they are only 3% now of the world's total zoo mass. Okay, I got that off my chest now. But I also want to suggest, and this is my subject, that there is something, among many other things, that intellectuals can do. Intellectuals, so to speak, I mean those who work with ideas as such. Something that we can do and should do, and that is to defend the humanities. I do mean the academic disciplines of the humanities, but not only that. I mean also the older and larger and looser traditions outside the academy as well as inside of the humanities. And it does seem to me that of all the kinds of learning which are our province, so to speak, the humanities hold the greatest green potential. That's my first claim, which I'm going to talk about. Not coincidentally, the humanities are also the most endangered form of learning. And prominent among their enemies are the sciences. So that's what my second claim is, and what I will then talk about. So why is it important to defend the humanities, which look increasingly like some sort of fabulous beast who's in danger of becoming extinct because its natural habitat is being eaten away? Well, one negative reason is that the attention that they're receiving from governments in the overdeveloped world in particular, from corporations and industries, and from the apologists, intellectual apologists for those parties already in the universities and in the media, consists basically of contempt and hostility, which is reflected in cuts in public spending and forced privatization of in the academy. This hostility is pretty targeted. It's not just random. It's not arbitrary. It's targeted. And it's interesting that the same mega machine that is driving ecocide is also out to get rid of the humanities. This kind of signals an elective affinity between the two targets, wild nature and the wild humanities. So I think that's one reason to consider resistance, consider the humanities as a potential site of resistance. A positive reason is the ability of the humanities, which I think is unique, really, to encourage ecological awareness and ecocentric values. 3 reasons, briefly. 1, to begin with, the humanities, as the name implies, are plural. They're loosely connected by a family resemblance, which is constellated by ideals of empathy and imagination and subjectivity. Given the monism of the mega machine, as dear old Mrs. Thatcher used to say, there is no alternative, this monism of this claimed monopoly of truth with perhaps a capital T that the mega machine ideologically makes, often through science, through the sciences, is a thinly secularized version of monotheism. And given that monism, the pluralism of the humanities is already significant. Secondly, the humanities are inherently relational. It's all about you and the other, okay? And given that relationality is the essence of ecology, ecology is precisely about relationships, we could describe the humanities as already ecological. Thirdly, although in the humanities it's humans who are doing the relating and the empathizing and the imagining, at the other end of that process, okay, of that dynamic, there is no restriction that isn't arbitrary on who or what is being related to, or empathized with, or imagined what it is to be like. There's no reason why the other party has to be human. We might put it this way, too. It is just their potential as eco-humanities that protects the humanities from becoming simply all about us, another anthropocentric enterprise, okay? So, also, I want to point out that the potential for reaching out to and respecting and revering and understanding as best we can other forms of life, okay, has a corresponding political value. In general, I want to give you the sense that all the stuff I'm going to be talking about, like metaphor and animism and so on, and that other people have talked about here, no matter how flaky it sounds, all has, when properly understood, very practical, pragmatic, and political consequences on the ground, okay? And the political value of the humanities is solidarity. It's not unity with other beings so that differences cease to exist. It's not hyper-separation so that we have nothing in common with them at all. It's that middle ground of solidarity with other beings than yourself and other kinds of beings. That's why the deep green philosopher Richard Sylvan said, quote, "The ecological community forms the ethical community." Right, who are we defending the humanities against? Well, most obviously capital, okay, which is investing ever more in what is called STEM studies, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, at the expense, directly, institutionally speaking, of the humanities, okay? But I have to make it clear that by science, what I mean really is what science has become. And the proper word for that, given that science and technology are now a seamless amalgam in practice, is technoscience. I see technoscience as one of three interlocking engines of the megamachine, the ecocidal megamachine. One is capital, which is in charge. That's why I don't agree with Eduardo. I think capital's the father, not the son. Anyway. The second is the state, which serves capital. And the third is technoscience. The reason I'm concentrating here not on capital and capitalism is because in terms of defending the humanities, it's technoscience that's significant because it provides the ideological, intellectual content for this program, as well as the technical knowledge, okay? It's a truism that, that scientism is problematic, okay? Scientism being the dogmatic assertion that science is uniquely privileged as a method of inquiry into the truth, okay? But science itself is perfectly valid and honorable pursuit, and there the matter rests. In my opinion, this does not go far enough because it fails to identify a systemic or structural problem with science as it has become that I think I can locate in the origins of science. Actually, it has deep roots, and it certainly has dire consequences. Let's take the consequences first briefly. You know, I've got to simplify radically, okay, because time. So, simplifying radically, yet again, technoscience is instrumental to ecocide. Its research is largely financed by private capital investment and protected by the state for its fiscal share of the profits. In industries such as anything with military applications, energy companies, pharmaceuticals, food industry, and new ways to survey and control populations. That's a significant one as well. Qualification number one. Surely science celebrates the wonders of the natural world and encourages us to appreciate them. Well, yes, that does still exist. But in actual practice, do you think that gets funded? It has been shunted largely into the media. I think of the wonderful English science presenter David Attenborough. Clearly has a powerful sense of wonder, scientific wonder. But basically, it's been shunted off into the media presentation and left as a kind of personal spiritual practice on the part of individuals and voluntary groups. Qualification number two. I realize there are many, many honorable people with high ethical standards motivated by ideals such as reducing suffering who are working in scientific research, maybe especially medical, okay? But unfortunately, that doesn't diminish my point that technoscience has now systematically and institutionally been corrupted by capital to an extent that it affects, even if it doesn't determine, all its outcomes. Look at the effect, for example, of the impact of the pharmaceutical industry on medical practice. It's overwhelming. Qualification number three, what about something like the IPCC, okay? Sure, very, very valuable. But the people on the ground, on the sharp end of climate change, where it's most extreme, they already knew that there was climate change happening, and they also had a pretty good idea of why it was happening. Whereas, could you have fracking without teams of geologists? No. When I consider this technoscience, quietly humming science parks, very well-funded, busy research labs, ever larger and more numerous data storage centers, I'm uncomfortable with romantic or views of science or ones that privilege it in any way, given its impact. Now, destructive and multiple impacts on embodied, sensual, lived life on Earth, I don't see some sort of transcendence or some sort of spirituality when I consider technoscience. I see a mode that Teresa Brennan, who incidentally is a wonderful social philosopher you should probably check out, summed up in the word pseudo-dispassionate. Could illustrate that in terms of the impact of science on animals directly through experimentation. It's in my paper, so I won't go there now. But what is it about the sciences that renders them problematic in the context of ecocide, but doesn't take in the humanities? Why doesn't the same thing affect the humanities? I think I can answer that by saying it's in their different relationships to metaphor. Okay, here is a crash course on metaphor. The classical example of metaphor is Achilles is a lion. Actually, that should be preceded by an exclamation. Oh, Achilles is a lion. Okay? Now, note that Achilles is a man, not a lion. If you just said, oh, Achilles is a man, well, you haven't said very much, right? Notice that it's not a simile like, oh, Achilles is like a lion in certain specifiable respects that don't contradict it. This is a domesticated metaphor, okay? No, it's an insight into Achilles such that he is both a man and a lion, okay? This is what Paul Ricoeur, the great theorist of metaphor, called the tensive truth of metaphor. It contains a tension between truths that are logically incompatible. It doesn't resolve that tension. It includes them, okay? And it tells us something new and fundamentally important about Achilles that without that realization, we wouldn't know, okay? The price of this tensive metaphorical truth, which you partly discover and partly create, is paradox. Now this metaphor, like this, has an epistemic function, which is, let's say, seeing Achilles as a lion, okay? But it also, more deeply, has an ontological function, being as, okay? Or perhaps even better, becomings as, but anyway, we'll leave that. The implication here is that everything and anything really only exists as something else as well, okay? Nothing and no one exists purely and sufficiently in itself or as itself. And I'll tell you why in a minute. The idea of anything in itself, or self-sufficiently itself, is a philosophical check that in William James's term can never be cashed in. As we say in my part of London, self-identity is a constitutive impossibility. Because this situation is this truth can be fleshed out in fully ecological terms. The natural world is the ongoing sum of its relationships, including those between living nature and the abiotic elements on which they depend, okay? Both internal, genes, proteins, cells, and so on, and external, sun, earth, rain, plants, other animals, etc., okay? All of these relationships are constitutive. The abiotic is completely into and with the living. The sentient depends on insentient. The non-human is implicated in the human. Okay? Hence the provisionality of all distinctions of inside and outside that was referred to earlier in the week. Okay? And these relationships comprise us. So really, we could actually say all living beings are embodied and ecological metaphors. And although metaphor is a relation, it's not a thing. You can't put your hand on it, okay? It's not idealist. It's not a spiritual or idealist add-on, okay? Life is metaphor all the way down and material all the way up. There's another aspect of the affinity between metaphor and nature. They're both wild, okay? As Ricoeur says, because we can only say what reality is to us at any given moment, there's no non-metaphorical standpoint. Anybody wants to criticize a model of reality or even criticize a metaphor can only do so through another metaphor. In other words, he says, metaphoricity is absolutely uncontrollable, or in my terms, it's wild. So there's an elective affinity, I'm arguing, between metaphor, which is the heart of the humanities, and wild nature, okay? And it is the heart of the humanities. You can't engage in that empathic understanding or imaginative or narrative understanding without remaining who you are, but also becoming the other party. I'm a man sitting in a room in London, reading a book about a woman living in 19th century somewhere else. I'm still me, but I'm also her, if the book works and if my imagination is working. I'm standing in an art gallery looking at a painting, but I'm also in the painting. And it seems to me this is very close to how shamanic perspectivism works as well. The shaman does not stop being a person, a human being, but also occupies the embodied perspective of the animal, becomes the animal in order to know what that animal knows. Okay? Animism, in my view, is not a belief. It's a practice. It's a way of life. And it doesn't ask anybody to surrender a sense of a distinction between animate and inanimate. All that it requires is that you abandon the theoretical belief that a priori you already know what can and cannot be a subject. And that you refuse to engage in modernist self-policing. Oh, I thought that mountain or stone or bird or whatever was telling me something, but actually my unconscious, as if it was my unconscious, and what's the unconscious, was projecting something onto it, which then came back to me. Oh, this crap, I'm sorry, okay? Cui bono? Who benefits from this self-policing, okay? This kind of programmatic disenchantment. You'll notice I'm not talking much about Gaia. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't talk about Gaia, think about it, and Bruno Latour's paper certainly convinced me of its potential value. But I prefer to concentrate as an alternative, complementary perspective on animism. The problem with Gaia, as I see it, is that its apparent singularity, there being only one Gaia, invites the very misunderstanding that Bruno wants to discourage, Gaia as God. Absolutely correctly. Because there is an imperium in every monism, okay? The effort to identify the supposedly one truth always carries with it the suggestion to compel universal recognition of that universal truth, to compel it universally. And as William James said, why should we envelop our many, our rich, sensuous, plural many as we experience life, with this one that brings so much poison in its train? But if you try and deal with that problem of how do we stop Gaia from becoming effectively God, if you try and deal with that problem through rigorous secularization, that's a cure that's even worse. God, with a capital G, does not exhaust the spiritual or the sacred. And it certainly doesn't exhaust the embodied and relational spirituality that is at the heart of animism. We must retain the ability and encourage it to recognize and respect the value, intrinsic value, not use value, of other lives, which is precisely where animism as a metaphoric mode comes in. Okay? It's clear to me where technoscience lines up here. Notwithstanding hybrids and vibrant matter and groovy aspects of nanotechnology and so on, in its formation and in its continuing self-constitution, it's fundamentally anti-metaphoric and anti-ecological. Actually, the potential of the humanities for an ecocentric apprehension of nature as living and wild and a subject is mirrored by the science's drive to turn it into something inanimate, bounded and inert, to be managed by world system governance or some horrible thing like that. Actually, this development is already underway in the United States under the Orwellian name of the New Conservation. Okay? They propose to extend private ownership and scientific management to the last remaining places of wild nature. Isn't that a great idea? Here we have a toxic ideology that's already razing the forests, poisoning the seas, and killing the animals, give me more of that. Why should the sciences have this hostility towards metaphor? What's the structural problem I mentioned? Jan Assmann calls it the Parmenidean distinction because it comes from Parmenides. If you want a dangerous idea, a really dangerous idea, forget Darwin. Parmenides had it a lot earlier, okay? A radical distinction between a perfect, unchanging, motionless, coolly masculine, invisible spiritual world beyond this one, and on the other hand, the sensuous, fecund, material world of generation, growth, and decay in particulars in which we live. In other words, the earth. Note that in equating divine truth, or logos, with what is, and falsehood, error, and delusion with what is not, the implication is the natural world not only is false, but ultimately doesn't exist at all. This toxic idea, which was rightly termed by Val Plumwood, a really important Australian ecofeminist philosopher, a philosophy of death, is still deeply in and circulating in the Western metaphysical imaginary, including the sciences. What bolder stroke could possibly be imagined? You take the earth, the source of life, and say, no, actually, death is life and life is death. I think you shouldn't make any mistake. Ecocide is inseparable from symbolic matricide. Okay? It is no coincidence that Gaia is the name not of a god, but of a goddess, and the ultimate maternal female figure who gives birth to both men and women, both the male and the female. Okay? Hence that matricide which I referred to a minute ago. And I can't flesh out this idea because I haven't got time, but there's an incredible book by Italian philosopher, feminist philosopher, Adriana Cavarero, called In Spite of Plato. You might want to look at that too. Basically, this idea of Parmenides filtered down through Plato. He kind of softened the blow by giving the world of appearances a sort of derivative secondary existence role, okay, down here, as opposed to up there where it's all really happening. But the point I want to make is that Aristotle, Plato's student, enshrined this, okay, in these so-called three logical truths, which are universal principles of reason. The first of which is the principle of identity. P equals P. A thing, if it really is itself. Secondly, non-contradiction. You can't have P and not P at the same time. You see how far we're drifting from ecology already? And the third, excluded middle. You must have choose, either P or not P. Okay? There's no third possibility. So that expresses perfectly Parmenides' assertion, the self-identity of what is and the non-existence of anything that isn't self-identical, whatever changes or moves or lives. Okay? So simple, doesn't it sound so innocuous? P equals P, but actually it's the foundation stone for empire. I think this is the aspect in the formation of the sciences that has permitted them to become technoscience and ecocidal. The contrast with classical and humane studies, I believe, could hardly be clearer. Okay. Of course, scientists practice metaphor too. They haven't got much choice. They have to, because science is actually impossible without metaphor. But the Parmenidean distinction enshrined in Aristotle's logic acts as a kind of constant imperative to suppress metaphor, to deny it, and to cancel out paradox, to get rid of paradox whenever possible. And along with it, the kinds of truths, ontological truths, that they can supply. So scientists tend to engage in metaphor in disguised, inadmissible, and unconscious ways that, ironically, simply make them harder to criticize, harder to be aware of, harder to discuss. I'm nearly done. So I'm also aware that I've idealized the humanities in this portrait, okay, because particularly departments of literature and philosophy have already sold the pass to an incredibly discouraging and stupid extent. They've opened themselves up to brain science, evolutionary biology, and cognitive psychology, giving science the final word. Oh, well, we thought this, and then we did the tests, and it turns out, whoa, what do you know? It really is like that, or it isn't really like that. Okay, science has the final word. I don't think so. I don't think we want to give up our independent and critical traditions quite that easily. Okay, actually, the sciences are coming to occupy the position in the old days of medieval theology. Not that the scientists have any sense of the irony of that. Medieval theology was queen of the sciences and final arbiter of knowledge. In that spirit, I would say, God save us from the Neuro Humanities. But despite all this, there are excellent practitioners remaining in the academy of the humanities. There are people increasingly outside the academy, having really many of them been driven out. Okay, the humanities are also turning to new forms, mainly online and semi-independent publications, online and in print. That's a good development. And finally, the potential that I described of the eco-humanities, I think is something that no amount of betrayal can destroy. Last thing I want to say is, what does all this have to do with what's going on in this respect in say, a country like Brazil? Well, obviously, Brazil is at the sharp end of a lot of the ecocide that I've been talking about, and the role of technoscience in that process. But in terms of the humanities, what does it look like? I think the implication of what I've been saying in a Brazilian or similar context would be the imperative to learn as much as possible, and perhaps as quickly as possible, from the equivalent of our Western humanities as practiced by indigenous cultures. Just the kinds of indigenous wisdom and knowledge practices that Eduardo, for example, has termed Amerindian philosophy. I'm not advocating indiscriminately adopting those perspectives, but they are potentially ecological, attuned to local and living nature to an extent that we need to recover, okay? And you want to contrast class to that? Gene hunters, or simply the disappearing of indigenous cultures and languages and ways of being human. They're humanities too. So in sum, I think in this time of ecocide, we must defend the humanities against all their enemies, including technoscience, and try our best to develop them further in local and indigenous cultural idioms. Thank you very much.